Welcome to Galloway Township, New Jersey. Approximately 115 square miles of water, wetlands, woodlands, farms, and meadows. Approximately 40,000 people live here, with homes, apartments, businesses, roadways, a railroad, a major wildlife refuge, a university, even part of an airport complex. By area, Galloway is the largest municipality in New Jersey and shares a water or land boundary with 12 other municipalities, including Atlantic City. It is diverse in geography, soils, vegetation, and land uses. Rich in history, Native Americans farmed and fished here long before settlers arrived from far-off lands. Native American pathways in colonial America shaped many settlement patterns that we see today. From the air, the vegetation looks fairly natural and normal. But when you look closely, there is another side of the landscape to examine. There are hundreds of invasive plant species growing in the Galloway Township area. You may not realize that you are looking at quite an alien landscape here, with invasives choking native plants and each other for dominance. Our history has brought about many disturbances to the land, and there have been introductions of non-native plants since colonial times. They were brought here from Europe, Asia, and elsewhere for ornamental landscaping, medicinal purposes, nursery rootstock, and more. The problems that we find today are deeply entrenched in the history and cultural traditions of land use and landscaping. The recreation of the European grass lawn model, for example, the search for ornamental plants that have an exotic wow factor, and plants whose leaves are not readily nibbled by beneficial local organisms. Let's think about this together. What trees, shrubs, vines, and perennial plants were here before us, and why? What organisms co-evolved with those plants? Why are these insects, birds, and pollinators so important? How far out of balance with nature are we? Some things are clear. It will take education, hard work, and cooperation to make changes. Here's a start. The Galloway Township Environmental Commission presents 12 Tenacious Invasives of the Galloway Township area. Brought to you through a generous grant from ANJEC, the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. This is an open space stewardship grant supported by the Sandy Batty Grant Fund. Here's Eric Schrading, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Agent with the New Jersey Field Office in Galloway.
One of the key things that is important to know about invasive species is their impact. Invasive species, from the perspective of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is that they reduce diversity in a lot of our marsh areas as well as uplands, and they do that by essentially creating a monoculture. It's one species, and that reduces overall vegetative diversity. And oftentimes when you have reduced vegetative diversity, you also have reduced diversity for fish and wildlife habitat. So invasive species are a big problem throughout New Jersey, and in particular in Galloway Township. And education is a key component of invasive species. Letting people know about recognizing them, as well as encouraging people to, when they go out and make plant purchases, to be only purchasing native plants. Recognition is important because a lot of invasives are early colonizers, and you disturb some soil somewhere, and one of the first ones that comes in is an invasive species. So even if you didn't plant it, it may still be there. So recognition is really important, and that's just based on educating people about what it is, what it looks like, so that they can recognize it early. But the other thing is, when you're out, shopping for plants to put in your front yard or in your garden or whatever, it's important to look at or be knowledgeable about, what is native and what is non-native. And one of the problems we see are these garden runaways, we call them, for invasives. A lot of times people will unwittingly or unknowingly plant an invasive in one location, and it does great. They intended them only to be there, and then next thing you know, it becomes a garden runaway and starts spreading across their yard and into the neighbor's yard and into some of our natural areas. We have lots of examples of garden runaways that are in our national wildlife refuges it wasn't planted by us, but we'll see that the neighbor right next door who planted Wisteria or something else all of a sudden invades into some of our natural areas like national wildlife refuges. So it's important to know what it is, and just know that even though you just planted it in that one spot, 10 years later, it can be in a lot of different places.
Now, to get to our specific 12 invasive plant species, here's Jessie Connor, resident of Port Republic, co-chair of the Southeast chapter of the New Jersey Native Plant Society, a master gardener, and former employee in retail plant sales.
So we're going to look at Japanese honeysuckle. This is a twining vine. You can see it twining itself up this utility post here in wire. It's also a trailing vine, so it's covered the ground, and you can see it running around underneath the trees, both in the sun and the shade. Identification points on this: the leaves are opposite, and they're kind of linear and pointed. At the base of the plant, when you get down towards the base, the leaves change and they're more lobed. They have little, they look a little bit more like an oak leaf. The native honeysuckle, which is very uncommon, lots of people plant it, but it's not one that you're going to find out in the New Jersey woods too much, has leaves that are fused together at the top. Beautiful red flowers in a tubular shape. This is not invasive. It doesn't run around on the ground. It won't climb up and take over trees and bushes. So this is a vine that spreads by runners, as you can see, and also by seeds, and forms dense mats on structures and also on trees and shrubs. And what it does to the native plant community is it shades them out. It changes the plant community underneath where the vine is growing. One of the problems we have is that this plant is still available in nurseries, and it's sold as Hall's honeysuckle. So you want to avoid buying that. You can find this in backyards, in forests, in areas that are disturbed. So it's very common throughout our area. This is Japanese barberry. This is a shrub that probably a lot of you are familiar with because it's planted everywhere in our county. It's in front of the convenience stores. It's in front of any new bank or commercial business that's being put up. And sometimes you see it with these green leaves, but often you're going to see it with a purplish reddish leaf. That's just a different cultivar. So why is this a problem? Let me help you identify it first in case you're not familiar with it. So it's a very thorny deciduous, meaning leaf-losing shrub, and it has thorns all up and down the stems. The leaves are in clusters and they're spoon-shaped. They're kind of spatulate-shaped. And it makes into a very full shrub from about 3 to 6 feet. It spreads by runners, and you can see a baby barberry right here. It also spreads by seeds that are dispersed by birds. This is a real problem in North Jersey and north of that, and it's becoming a problem in South Jersey. The reason it's a problem is because it's not eaten by deer, and it can invade the understory, and we see some plants over here and over here. So it's happy in the shade as well as being in the partial shade and out into the sun. It's very adaptable. And what's happened is that we have stands of barberry underneath our deciduous forests, our protected forests, as well as along the roadsides, and that's the only shrub you'll see. The deer don't eat it, it spreads very quickly, and it outcompetes our native tree seedlings and also native wildflowers and other shrubs. So we have a monoculture, and the monoculture is just barberry. So even though this is sold locally, it's really a problem and one you want to consider removing and telling your neighbors about. So what I have surrounding me is very fragrant, somewhat pretty, but really destructive autumn olive. And this is a very common shrub to small tree in South Jersey. It is blooming at this time of the year in mid-spring. It can be identified by its silvery leaves. They're very silvery on the bottom, very linear, very fragrant, small, tubular yellow flowers. It has thorns on the stem, and one of the problems we have is that it creates thorny, dense thickets. So I'm standing in front of one autumn olive. There's another one and another one and another one behind me, and this is what you see on roadsides, on the edges of fields, almost everywhere in South Jersey. It'd be very hard to go down a road where you don't encounter autumn olive. This was once recommended by the soil conservation people and now is considered a noxious weed, and one that you want to consider trying to control if it's on your home landscape. Some people confuse this with Russian olive. Autumn olive and Russian olive look alike, but on the East Coast we mostly have autumn olive. They behave in the same way though. This is Multiflora Rose, and you're probably thinking of rose bushes as being 4 or 5 feet high and perfectly in control. But Multiflora Rose acts like a vine. And when it's acting like a vine, it climbs up trees. And it's very hard to see, but this tree that it's climbed up is a cherry being compromised. Eventually it'll be killed by this, because all of the leafage that you see here, extending out way over to here, is Multiflora Rose. I want to show you how you can ID it, because we have some native roses that are very worthwhile, but this non-native is considered a noxious weed, just like the autumn olive that we looked at previously. The leaf is divided into 5 or more leaflets, up to 11, but the easiest way to identify this is if you look down at the base of the leaf where it's attached to the stem. That's called the petiole. It's fringed. Another ID is in mid to late spring. This is a plant that flowers profusely, and you're going to see on the roadsides, in disturbed areas, even in people's backyards, Multiflora Rose blooming with 5 white petals, fragrant, and it's all over our county. Why is it bad? Like a lot of the things we're looking at today, it outcompetes the native vegetation. And you can see just from this one plant that has propagated itself by underground runners, and also just by rooting. When this branch comes down and touches the ground, it roots, and then it takes off and it continues, and it can spread and create rose thickets, which are impenetrable. You can see by the size of the thorns, this is not something that you would want to tangle with unless you had to. We find it on the edges of old fields, as I said, even in people's backyards. So another way it's spread is by the rose hips that the birds eat, but mostly when you see this, it's spreading itself by vegetatively, by runners, by arching canes down to the ground. This got here originally back in the 1800s as a rootstock for our native roses, and also because people thought it was ornamental. Like a lot of the invasive plants we have nowadays, originally this was something that people really wanted to plant in their yards. So I'm standing in front of a wisteria vine. It's mid-spring, and the wisteria is flowering now. It has these large hanging clusters of light lilac flowers. They're very fragrant, and that's an easy ID in the spring. And if you traveled around southern New Jersey, you've seen this climbing up into the tree canopy on the sides of the roads in old abandoned places where houses were. Another way to identify it is by the leaves. The leaves are compound, so this is one leaf with multiple leaflets that are opposite each other and pointed. This is a member of the pea family, and one of the way it reproduces is by its seed pod. It hasn't formed any seed pods yet. They'll come from these flowers. But when it does, this vine will have hanging pods that will remind you of a legume, of a member of the pea family, and they'll be maybe about 7 inches long and very fuzzy. The way that this reproduces is by overground roots, and you can see in the area I'm standing in, this has taken over the entire side of this little roadway and formed what's referred to as a wisteria thicket. So there's little plants coming up all over at my feet. As the vines grow up, they twine around each other. It's a very muscular vine. It can grow very quickly, it can grow up to 70 feet, and it can be 15 inches diameter. So this can grow into a huge vine that can take down structures. It can take down trees and shrubs, and it changes the understory of the plants that it's climbing up on. It kills trees pretty quickly. There's a cherry tree up here that's not long for the world, and you can see some of this mass down here are trees that have actually been toppled by this vine. Unfortunately, this vine, Japanese or Chinese wisteria, they both behave in the same way. They're still sold locally, and you can find them for sale at one of the major supermarket chains annually. We do have a native wisteria, much better behaved vine, but it's very difficult to purchase. It flowers later in the year. Most what you're going to see out there is either the Japanese or the Chinese. They originally came to our country in the early 1800s and have become very problematic for our native plant community and for the structures that they climb up and for the trees and shrubs that they bring down every year. So this is a Norway maple. They can grow to 40 to 50 feet tall typically, and sometimes as high as almost 100 feet tall. They have dark green, opposite leaves that have 5 lobes to them. One of the ways that you can tell a Norway maple from our native red maple is that when you break a twig or when you pull a leaf off, you have some milky sap that's exuded. That doesn't happen on a red maple. Another way you can tell is just by the habit of the tree. It has these big leaves and it creates dense shade. I have a branch of red maple here to show you the difference. This is our local native maple in South Jersey, and it has 3 lobes on the leaves. The leaves are a good bit smaller than Norway maple. Another way to distinguish them is by the keys. And we have some keys here to look at. And the keys of Norway maple form a very broad shape, whereas the keys of your red maple form a much tighter V shape. Why is this tree a problem? Many of you maybe have it planted in your front yard. It's still for sale in our nurseries, but it is considered a problem because of the dense shade it creates. And also its shallow root structure. So the shallow root structure and the dense shade make it very difficult for native plants to exist below this tree. They're shaded out. The shallow roots are sucking up all the moisture and outcompeting the native shrub and herbaceous forest community. And this is a plant that can go and you find in urban situations, suburban situations, and it's also one that's jumped into our protected lands, our deciduous forests. I'm standing in front of some Japanese knotweed. It looks kind of like a shrub, but it's actually a perennial, so it comes up every year from its rootstock and jumps up quickly in the spring from 4 to 8 feet tall. It has a stem that's going to remind you of bamboo. It's smooth and it's jointed and it's hollow. Later in the year, in the summer, it has arching sprays. We can see a little bit of the bits that are left over from last summer. So it has arching sprays, white flowers, very decorative, very ornamental. It came to us in the late 1800s as an ornamental plant, but it's really a beast. And let me tell you why. The rhizomes of Japanese knotweed can go 45 to 60 feet and spread underground and take over an area. It likes low-lying areas like this one, but it's highly adaptable. A main reason I call this a beast is because it's very difficult to get rid of. It spreads very quickly, and it's adapted to almost every condition you can think of. It puts up with high salinity, it puts up with droughts, floods, sun, and shade. So this is a plant where if there's a little bit of moisture, it'll jump in and grow very quickly and spread very, very aggressively and outcompete and exclude native vegetation. This is a fairly new stand of mugwort. Mugwort is a perennial that's invaded all parts of southern New Jersey and elsewhere. It looks a little bit like chrysanthemum, which is a plant you might have purchased at the store. The leaves are heavily lobed and they're whitish underneath, unlike chrysanthemum. But if you break off a leaf, this really smells like sage. That's another way to tell it apart. If this patch here was more established, these plants would be a couple feet high already. They come up as high as 5 feet in one season. And they spread by underground roots, which just take over an area very quickly. It forms dense colonies. And in a few years, if nothing is done about this, it will completely take over the edge of this roadside here and go into the more forested areas as well. It puts chemicals into the soil which inhibit the growth of other plants. So that's another reason why it's able to outcompete other plants. This is in the family of Artemisia, and people use plants in that family like Dusty Miller. That's a plant you might have bought at the local nursery as ornamental plants. Unfortunately, this one is very aggressive and is taken over. So it's a non-native ornamental that is doing real damage to our local ecosystem. You can find it in meadows, along roadsides, agricultural fields, where it's growing in with crops, in both urban and suburban areas. It's hard to go anywhere without finding mugwort. So what we have in front of us is Tree of Heaven. Some of you might know this as Ailanthus. It's a tree that puts on, loses all its leaves in the winter, but its leaves are actually quite large compound leaves. So this leaf is going to grow to be this big and compound. And when it loses all its leaves, they kind of look like a bunch of sticks. Its new foliage in the spring has a reddish raspberry kind of tint to it, so that's another way to recognize it. It makes flowers in the summer, and they're large clusters of flowers that hang down, which turn into papery seeds that are wind dispersed. It also is able to colonize the ground by its rootlets, and you can see that this is probably very clonal. All these trees are related to each other, going under the ground to form this little grove. The plants are so aggressive that they can come up through structures, and they can damage things like sewer pipes and foundations. So this is a tree that poses problems in a lot of different ways. I want to mention another way to identify it, because this can be confused with our native sumac. In fact, some people call this Chinese sumac. But two other ways of identifying this are by looking at the leaf scar, where it loses its compound leaf in the winter, and the leaf scar is very heart-shaped. And the second way of identifying it, I'm a little reluctant to do here, but if you crush the leaves, it smells like rotten peanut butter. So this is another really good way of identifying it from sumac, which is a very valuable native shrub. And another reason, if I didn't give you enough already, to know that this is a problematic tree is it's the host plant for the spotted lanternfly. And you might have heard about the spotted lanternfly, which is moving east from Pennsylvania and other states into New Jersey. This is its host plant. So that's another compelling reason to get rid of Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus, if you have it on your property. So I'm standing in front of some Asian bittersweet. Asian bittersweet is a twining vine. It has yellow fruits in the fall that split and open up to a bright orange, reddish orange berry. Some of you might know this as an ornamental that you've used to do fall decorations with. In the landscape, it's a vine that really poses a problem. In fact, some people have called this the Asian kudzu. And if you know kudzu in the South, kudzu is a vine that can take over very quickly. This vine takes over very quickly too. It spreads by underground roots and climbs trees very quickly. One of the things it does, I'm going to show you here, is it winds around itself as it climbs. So while the individual vine might not be too strong, 5 or 10 vines all together can actually pull trees down and girdle them. This is a very common plant. You're going to see it along the roadsides, coming up in your home landscapes. It will outcompete other native vegetation. It'll grow in some shade and sun, so it's adaptable to different conditions. And as I said before, it can kill trees, even large trees. One of the things you can do to identify it is pull up a small one, and look at its roots, which are orange colored. The leaves are alternate, and they're fairly round, fairly orbicular, with little teething. But I find that the best idea, if you have a small one coming up in your yard, is simply to pull it up and look at those bright orange roots, because these leaves look pretty generic. Another way to ID it is to notice it in the fall and then determine how you're going to deal with it in the spring. Japanese bittersweet, like a lot of the plants we talked to today, originally came from Asia in the 1800s. This one came around 1860s. It was thought to be very ornamental. The reason why so many of the plants we're talking about came from Japan, Korea, and China is it's on the same latitude as we are. So the plants there had a very easy time adapting to our temperature and climate in this part of the world. We're standing in front of a patch of English ivy, and I think English ivy is a plant that most of you know from the Ivy Leagues and crawling up buildings in Europe and in the United States. It has aerial rootlets, and the leaves are somewhat waxy, dark green. They have 3 points when they're young, and then as they get older and they climb up and they have more sunlight either on the ground or in a tree, the leaf shape actually changes and becomes more unlobed. And at that point, the English ivy, the character of the plant really changes. The sunlight causes it to branch out and to flower. Those flowers form seeds that are then dispersed by birds. So this has a couple ways of reproducing, either by birds putting the seeds around or by the rootlets that form at all the leaf nodes, where it can root into the ground and bifurcate so that you have an area like this that's quickly covered with English ivy. The third way it gets transported is really by human beings. People buying it as a ground cover, letting it go up their trees, and then it begins to climb other trees. So you can see we're next to a yard, English ivy growing up the trees. Now we're into more of a public area where English ivy is taking over all of these trees as well. While we like the looks of English ivy, if we let it get out of control like this, it can be very damaging to the trees and to our neighborhoods. I'm standing in front of a landscape in Galloway, and a homeowner has given us permission to film the Bradford pears that they put in many years ago. Bradford or Galloway pears are another non-native, planted as an ornamental. They form a vase-like shape to them, and their limbs are often very weak and they're short-lived. They have round, orbicular kind of leaves that are have a little bit of a wavy edge to them. The leaves are alternate. This is a tree that flowers very early in the spring. It flowers in April And so it's really easy to ID then, either lying down a driveway like this in a person's landscape, or where Bradford pears have escaped into vacant lots along roadsides. They were once thought to be sterile and highly touted by the landscape community, but now we know they're not sterile, and they've jumped into disturbed habitat and roadside edges and any piece of land that's not being used. They've jumped into and formed thickets. And when that happens, they are very thorny, very aggressive. They spread by the birds eating, and wildlife eating the small brownish red fruits that they form. They're really problematic, and a plant that is still sold in nurseries, and one that you want to think twice about purchasing, or if you have them and you're in a situation where they're going to escape into undisturbed areas, you want to think about removing them from your yard.
I want to emphasize the importance of partnerships. Fish and Wildlife Service has a lot of programs where we focus on trying to control invasive plants, but it really takes a lot of partnerships to be able to effectively look, control, and monitor invasives, and that comes with folks like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Galloway Township, the green teams, counties, states, and probably most importantly is private landowners. I mean, most of the invasives that are out there in New Jersey sit on private lands, and so the education component of private landowners knowing what's on their land, and then having the education and knowledge to be able to control or at least minimize the amount of invasives on their land is important. So private landowners are really a key component of that partnership. And I guess finally, I'd just like to say that it's important to take action. And even if that action is just becoming a little more knowledgeable about what invasives are, what they look like, how to recognize them, how to monitor them, that's the first step. At least if you've become knowledgeable, that's great. If you want to take that beyond and really look at ways to control invasives and replace that with native species, then there are a lot of resources out there to help you with that. So that's kind of where we need to go. There's a tremendous amount of invasives out there on the landscape. If we can take small steps towards reducing that and replacing those with natives, that's really what our goal is.
The Galloway Township Patriot Lake area is a prime test case due to poor and disturbed soils, some bad plant choices in the past for the many memorial gardens, and a barrage of seeds that are spread by wind, water, birds, and other animals. All of the efforts at remediation for this video have taken place at this location. Many of the folks pictured are volunteers who also work on the Galloway Township Municipal Rain Garden, which also needs regular monitoring and weeding. Through group efforts of lopping, chopping, mowing, pulling, sawing, and hauling, tons of invasive plant material have been removed. Manual controls are quite selective and effective. It is always important to do something with the soil and the area as soon as the invasives are removed to prevent a possible reoccurrence. Whether you are planting a new area of ground or remediating an area, remember that invasive plant seeds and runners are always going to try to sneak in. Be on the lookout. Chemical controls are the least desirable option. We have not made that a part of our remediation regimen, particularly at Patriot Lake, for the health of the wildlife, pollinators, water quality, and possible interaction with the many users of this facility. It is best, in any case, to use the least toxic remediation. If some systemic herbicide is needed in extreme cases, it is best to use a professional who will apply or inject very low to the ground and not broadcast over a high and wide area after the plants have been cut. An example of such an extremely problematic invasive is bamboo. Some native plants can be aggressive and need periodic thinning. The aggressive nature can also be a great asset in helping to reclaim areas under remediation. So please help support the plant nurseries and stores that use native plants as their business model. If you have or may hire a landscaper, ask that your agreement be tailored to non-toxic care, designing with native plants and safe removal of invasives. Make note of places that still sell invasive plants and let them and others know about it. So what is the best outcome for your yard and our public spaces? Our fields, meadows, forests, farms, and gardens need our attention and our care. The proof that we have succeeded is when birds, pollinators, and the insects that nibble our leaves are doing their ancient dance in the circle of life. Along with this production, the ANJEC grant has allowed the Galloway Township Environmental Commission to compile and distribute a companion brochure entitled 12 Tenacious Invasive Plants and Native Alternatives for Southern New Jersey. Please contact the Environmental Commission or Go Green Galloway through the Galloway Township Office of Sustainability. This problem with tenacious invasives, it seems too big to overcome. Are there possibly any tenacious people out there who can stand up to them?
Not my first rodeo.
We do.